everyone at Better Red Than Dead. We're very excited to see you on Zoom tonight to celebrate the release of The Other Side of Absence, written by Betty O'Neill. Tonight, Betty's in conversation with fellow author and Better Red Literary Tour's memoir mentor, Patti Miller. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded. If you don't want to be filmed, you can turn off your camera settings. But before we begin the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners on the land upon which we meet tonight. These will be different lands depending on where you're zooming in from. For me in Newtown, it's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that Better Red Than Dead is built. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The Other Side of Absence is a memoir of resilience and strength as a daughter reconciles the damage and trauma wrought on families by war. Betty O'Neill is a writer and a teacher with an eclectic range of degrees from many top Australian universities. Currently, she's a lecturer in creative intelligence and innovation at the University of Technology, Sydney. Patti Miller is an award-winning writer of 8 books spanning fiction, non-fiction and memoir. She's also a tutor and a passionate mentor of other writers. We're very grateful for Patti's contribution to Better Ed Literary Tours. We're also looking forward to her Introduction to Travel Memoir Writing Workshop, which is happening on the 26th of September. There'll be a Q&A session towards the end. Feel free to type any questions you have into the group chat and we'll answer them via video once the time comes. So without further ado, here's Patti to kick things off.
Thanks, Emma. That's great. It's lovely to be here and lovely to see Betty and her book reaching the bookshelves in the bookshops. I want to also acknowledge the Gadigal storytellers of this land, because they've been telling stories here for tens of thousands of years, and we are merely continuing that tradition of storytellers. So I'd like to honour the storytellers of the Gadigal nation. You've had a little bit of an introduction to Betty from Emma. I'd like to just mention my personal kind of connection with Betty, because I think it started with a memoir workshop. I think it was at Sydney University some years ago now. And then Betty gave me another memoir manuscript to look at, not this one. And that was in, I think, 2009, a manuscript that I did some work on for her, and we talked about it and discussed it. And then Betty came to the Paris Memoir Workshop with a wonderful group of people, some of whom might be here tonight, I hope. I can't scan. Oh, I see someone waving there, and a few people waving there, so that's lovely. Lovely to see you. Betty was, I thought, going to be working on that manuscript that I talked with her about, but something else happened, and it was really in Paris where this particular book was born, but I didn't really know that at the time, and maybe Betty didn't know either that something was being born at that moment. But to give a little bit of context, and I'm going to ask Betty about that in a moment, but to give a little bit of context, some of you probably don't have the book yet, so I'd just like to give an outline of it by reading the blurb at the back, so that you've got a bit of a context for what I'm going to be asking and what Betty's going to be saying. And it's about the fact that Betty grew up knowing very little about her father, Antony. She knew that he'd fled Poland after World War II, that he'd disappeared overnight when she was just a baby, and that his brief appearance when she was a young adult, I think 19, had been a harrowing, painful ordeal. 55 years after he deserted her family, Betty becomes determined to solve the mystery of her absent father and discover exactly who he was. When her search takes her to Poland, Betty unexpectedly inherits a family apartment from the half-sister she never knew, a time capsule of her father's life. Sifting through photos and letters, she begins to piece together a picture of her father as a Polish resistance fighter, a survivor of Auschwitz and Gusen concentration camps, an exile in post-war England, and a migrant to Australia. But the deeper she searches, the darker the revelations about her father become, as Betty is faced with the disturbing truth or disturbing truths rather, buried within her family. So that gives you an outline of the scope of this story, which is quite extraordinary. But what I want to start with is the beginning, because I think beginnings are quite good places to see where the book is going to go. And I'm going to read just the opening paragraph and then ask Betty a question about the birth of this book. It starts, there's a date, 21st of November 2013. 70 years after my father's arrest by the Gestapo for his part in World War II Polish resistance in a city where I didn't speak the language or know anyone, I was looking for the truth about my dead father. With a bunch of keys in my hand, I worked my way through the 5 locks on the front door until finally I was able to push it open. I reached round the door jamb and fumbled for a light switch. Flick, 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 nothing. No lights, but the central heating was working, and on that cold November day, it was warm inside, uncomfortably warm. I left the front door open to let in some light, but even so, being in that forsaken apartment in Poland made me uneasy, an uninvited intruder into my father's secret life, even though the past inhabitants were long dead. Part of me was already heading for the door. Part of me was desperate to know more. And that, of course, makes me desperate to know more from that opening. But I just wanted to ask you, what was it in Paris that meant that this book was born, or the seed of it was sown? How did that happen?
Thanks, Patti. It was a very unexpected event that occurred, and it was a piece of homework that you gave us on that very first evening. And that piece of homework was, you gave us the beginning of a sentence, and that sentence was the first time I met, and you asked us to keep writing and then to bring that back to class the following day. So I wrote the first time I met, and nothing came immediately, but then I ended up writing the first time I met my father. I was 19. And I kept writing about that very first meeting with him when I was 19. And then you asked us to add to this story every day, which I wasn't expecting either. And it was then that I realised that I knew very little about this man, and I had nothing to add. So I then became curious, and it really was the catalyst for me wanting to find out who was this man, Anthony Ugilski, who was my father.
So in that moment, you didn't know that it was going to be a book at that moment?
No idea. I didn't even know that it was going to be much more than, 10 minutes of finishing off a sentence. So yeah. it really did expand enormously from that first exercise. Yeah.
Yes, 10 years ago.
10 years ago, that's right.
Nearly, yes. So the early part of the book, the first couple of chapters, is actually about your extraordinary childhood as a foster child. And I was wondering if you would tell us a bit about that, why you were a foster child. And then I also wanted to know as well, this is a double-barrel question, I wanted to know why you decided that the story wasn't about your childhood, because it was extraordinary in itself, why the story was not your childhood but your absent father. So tell us about that, why you were a foster child, and then why you decided not to write about that really in a lot of detail, but about your father.
Yes, so when my father married my mother in England, so she was an Australian who had gone to London, she'd gone on a working holiday, which was a bit unusual in 1952. So she was quite courageous and quite brave, I think, to do that. She went on her own. They met in London, they married, I was born, we came to Australia. And not long after my father, his arrival was delayed by about 6 months, but not long after he arrived, he actually disappeared overnight. And that was just from some very mild questioning from my mother, who had received a letter from a mutual friend of theirs in England, Olga, who had escaped from Europe at the end of the war as well. And in this letter that she had written to Mum, apart from saying how much she missed her and so on, she had also said, "I'm now so glad that you now know everything about him." And there were no more details. So Mum read this and had no idea what Olga was talking about. But when she questioned my father, she didn't say she'd had a letter. She just said to him, is there anything that you need to tell me? Is there anything we need to talk about? We're just starting our new lives in Australia. Is there something you need to say? And she told me that he just looked at her and took his time. And then he said, no, there's nothing. And he went for his evening walk, which he did every night, both in London and in Lismore, which is where we were living with my grandmother up in the north coast of New South Wales. So he went walking and Mum was left there wondering, she told me later, she sort of reflected back on that moment and thought, I wonder if he had actually decided to tell me what had happened at that point. You know, our lives would have been very different. So I don't know whether they would have been better or worse, but they certainly would have been different. So he disappeared and we didn't see him again.
So he didn't come back from his evening walk?
Yes, he came back from his evening walk. They went to bed and then the next morning Mum woke up and he wasn't in bed. She went looking for him. He wasn't in the house, he wasn't in the backyard, and she came back and she looked at the top of the wardrobe and his suitcase was gone and so was he. And so then we didn't see him again. So the next time that Mum saw him was when I was about 6. She decided to file for divorce. She ended up working in a hotel and that was the training that she had had. So she'd managed a hotel in Melbourne initially before she went to England, and then when she came back, that was the work that she got, was managing a hotel, and it was a live-in position and I wasn't able to live with her. So I was then fostered out to, I think it was almost a dozen families between the age of 2 and 9. And then when I was 9, I went to boarding school. So I lived with a lot of different families in that time. And when I was about 6, Mum had told me, well, later she told me that she was approaching her 30th birthday and she had decided that she was going to have a party for her 30th birthday. And one of the regular customers was a local solicitor, and he said to her, Nora, why don't you just tidy this all up, give yourself a birthday present and file for divorce and, you know, have that sorted out. And so she did. She filed for a divorce on the grounds of desertion, which is what you did in those days. And she then found that it was a much longer process than anticipated, as my father was a bigamist. He was already married when he married my mother. And so she then found out that he had this other wife who was still alive in Poland and also had another daughter as well by that marriage, who was also alive and living in Poland. So those early years for me were spent, I would see Mum from time to time. She would come and visit when she could. And sometimes she would take me out for the afternoon. Working in a hotel is pretty grueling in terms of, you know, social hours and so on. So life wasn't easy for her as a single parent in the 50s and 60s. And life wasn't easy for me as a foster child either.
But you decided that you would write the story about the search for your father rather than about your childhood.
That's right. And that really came about from the Paris workshop. You know, when I began to write about my father and realised that I knew very little, I was thinking about, well, what do I know? And when I came back from that workshop, my mother was still alive at that time, and I spoke with her about it and I asked her how she would feel about me, you know, looking for some of the information about him and starting to put his life together. And I think that it was really interesting to start to find some of the pieces. So Mum I started with 2 photos and a couple of documents. And one of those documents was my father's demobilisation papers after the war. And my mother had kept those. So I had some information about where he had been and what he had done. But, you know, as you read at the beginning, I met him when I was 19 and then he disappeared again. And he told Mum and I that he was going back to Poland. He thought he was dying and he wanted to be buried there. So my first port of call was really to find out, had he died? Well, I knew that he would have died by the time I started looking because he was 20 years older than my mother. He was born in 1909. So he'd actually lived as a child through the First World War, through the democracy of Poland between the wars, and then, you know, through the Second World War. And
I wanted to ask you then, and just a very short paragraph, and I wanted to ask you about that, about how you got into the kind of, I don't know, the inside your father in a way, you know, into his mind. And this is the paragraph you wrote. I look up at the windows trying to picture my father. Helena and Janina, living there. I imagined the Gestapo boots loud on the steps up to number 5, bursting in the door and arresting Antoni Yergolevsky, resistance fighter. Was he hiding? Did he struggle? Did he call out, "Don't worry, I'll be back," without knowing it would take 3 decades? And that, imagining him saying, "Don't worry, I'll be back," seemed to me very sort of poignant and tender. And I think, did you actually was it difficult, and did you get inside your father, do you think? And was that difficult to do?
Well, it was very difficult to do because I started off with so little information, but I started out with the intention of finding out what had led him to make the decisions that he made. So that was both to leave Mum and I, to return to Poland. So trying to understand that was really the intention. So you asked me earlier about why did I write about that rather than my childhood. Well, I guess I came to write about my childhood because my childhood and what happened to me was a result of what happened in the war, and it was a result of those decisions that he had made. And so discovering some of the reasons that he had made those decisions then led me to think about, well, you know, war has a very long tail. And it really does not just impact the people who go to war, but it impacts the families that they come back to when they're expected to just come back and, you know, slot back into everyday life without actually much help at all. And we know even today that people, you know, returning from war suffer from post-traumatic stress, they suffer from mental health issues, and we don't do very much to really look after them. Yes. So I had some awareness of that, but starting to look for all of those clues about my father and, you know, for the decisions that he had made and what had actually shaped him, because what shaped him eventually shaped me as well. And yes. So those pieces, as they came together, I started to form this picture of this man, and I don't know whether I ever actually got inside his head. He was a complex person, and I think we all are. You know, we're not good, we're not bad, we're neither one nor the other. We're a mixture of all of those things. So we're complex human beings, and you know, the culture and the context, and there are so many things that influence how we behave and the sorts of decisions that we make. I often think, you know, as I was reading so many of the stories of survivors and people who didn't survive, and, you know, histories of the camps, and you sort of think about, my goodness, you know, what did happen to them afterwards, and, you know, what were their lives like afterwards?
Yes, it's not over when it's over, you know, and I think that's what I like about your book, that, you know, that it's not black and white. You know, if you can look at your father from the outside and judge him, you know, as wicked for abandoning his family, but when you look at his experience and what happened to him, it's not so easy to judge. And I think that's one of the things I like about your book, you know, that you, although you've got every reason to, you don't judge against your father. And I think it makes it all the more powerful, I think. I also wanted to look at, there's a particular section in the book that I'd like you to read, which is to me really interesting. And when I came to it, it kind of stopped me in my tracks. It was a kind of a repetition about return not desired, which has a lot of implications that are both political and personal. So I'm wondering if you could read a little bit of that. It's on page 194. And it's when you are in Vienna, trying to find or follow some of the leads that you have.
In the rooftop bar of my hotel in Vienna, I sipped a glass of chilled Austrian Gewürztraminer and breathed out weeks of tension. I was feeling a little anxious about my visit to the archives, and particularly the Mauthausen concentration camp, which had been designated by the Nazis as a Category 3 camp. Its purpose was plain and simple: extermination by work. The prisoners' records were marked "Return not desired." Return not desired. These words echoed in my head and my heart. By the end of this story, these 3 words would be the mantra of my father's life. Return not desired by the Nazi invaders of his country who had incarcerated him. Return not desired by the Soviet occupiers of his country after the war. Return not desired by his wife and daughter. Too late, or so it seemed from his letters. Return not desired by my mother, Nora. Financial or other support not required. Contact not desired. Return not desired by me from the moment I met him and continued throughout his relentless pursuit of me. Relief when he boarded that plane to Poland for the last time. Relief he would not return to Australia. But none of us stated this as clearly as the prisoner record cards.
That strikes me as extraordinarily powerful. You know, it seems to sum up all of, I guess, the griefs and tragedies and sorrows of your father's life, both personal and political. I was wondering if that phrase and the implications of it, if you could tease them out a little bit, return not desired, but also that, did that phrase give you a new sympathy for your father?
Yes, it did, because I just wondered what it must have been like to have been rejected. And I think there's a part in, well, I know there's a part in the book that I actually write about being able to recognise that feeling of being rejected and being not wanted and being not loved, not cared about, not wanted in somebody else's life. And that happened to me many times as a child, moving from one family to another. So that return not desired, when I read it on the prisoner record card and it was underlined, and I just thought, my goodness, it happened to my father so many times through his life. And that must have been such a difficult thing, when I'm sure, when the photo on the front of the book is from him in 1937, before the war began, when he was 28. And I look at that photo of him, striding down the street and looking so confident, and he would have had his whole life, ahead of him, thinking that here he was in democratic Poland and living well. He had a wife, he had a child at that time. It seemed like he had a very good life at that time. So to go from, those photos, which I found in the apartment, and other photos of him at that time, and even when he was younger, when he was first married to his first wife, and to go from that and to follow his trail through all of the things that happened to him, and just to have these sentences just came to me as a summary of some of the turning points in his life, really.
Yes, but that return not desired, which were the words written on the card, I mean, that actually means to be killed.
Yes. In Gusen camp, in Auschwitz, where he was originally. In that camp, he was sent to Block 11, which it was amazing that he actually survived that and was able to then go on to. He worked in Auschwitz. He worked near the ovens, and he was actually responsible for removing the bodies and from the gas chambers and taking them to the ovens. So then he was sent to, from there, in 1942, there were a number of political prisoners, which he wasn't Jewish, although, he was sent to Auschwitz, but they then wanted to make room for a large influx or a large transportation of Jewish people over many years being sent to Auschwitz. So he was moved to Gusen then. But Gusen was that category 3 camp where people were sent to die. They didn't want them to return. They didn't want them to, to rehabilitate in any way. But actually that changed towards the end of the war. Towards the end of 1944, it changed because the Germans were then short of manpower. And where my father was in Gusen was a camp that was based on the quarry, and they were quarrying and chopping out, stones from this massive quarry. And that's one of the reasons that my father actually survived, that he put his hand up and said that he was a stonemason. And so he then worked under cover, and both in the winter and the summer, but particularly in the winter, to be able to work under cover, was a boon. But he was also then found to be trying to sabotage, and he was beaten really badly and sent to the hospital, which was unusual. most people had been just left to die because there was no value put on human life. And so when he was taken to the hospital, there was a Polish doctor who was working in that hospital who took care of him and made sure that he was all right. And he actually ended up, the last detail on that prisoner record card says that he was in the potato kitchen when the camp was liberated. So he was warm and he had food. And so that was one of the reasons that he had actually survived. But there were hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who died in all of the camps, of course, but these category 3 camps were particularly designed for people to be sent to, and they were just, fodder for work and just to try to, keep those quarries going to provide, stone for Hitler's Reich that he was building. And particularly, Gusen was just near Linz in Austria. And Linz was, Hitler had spent time there and he wanted to build it as an amazing city. And so that was part of his intention. And there are lots of records about how he worked with others to do that and to try to build that city to be something beautiful. And all of the prisoners in the camps were there just as labourers. And if they died, they died. And sometimes they were treated really badly.
And I think that's another thing that I like about it, that you don't kind of celebrate his survival. It's not like the triumph of the individual or anything like that. You give full weight to the millions who died. That it was really just a chance that he survived. So I think it's very impressive the way that you give full weight to the experience, but it's at the same time I didn't find it a heavy read. It was grounded in a tragic and terrible political and personal reality, but it didn't ever feel to like that I was wading through the horrors. And I think that was because that you gave us always your personal journey in terms of trying to find out about your father. But I would like to ask you what it was actually like for you. I mean, you've talked about what it must have been like for your father, but what was it like for you to visit these concentration camps?
I found it really quite harrowing, and I'm sure that most people who have visited, or who know people who have visited, would probably find that they had a similar reaction and a similar response. But I feel like I had 2 hats on, really. I had this hat that was a researcher hat, a historian hat, that I really wanted to find out more. I'd studied history when I was at school. I loved history at school, and I remember coming, first in my class for modern history, and I've studied ancient history as well. So I've always, been fascinated by history and the stories that come from it and what we can learn from it. And it was, way back at school that I came across, Man's Search for Meaning. So I read that without ever having any idea of, what was going to unfold at this time of my life and this book that I've written. But following, through history, and I also studied history at university as well. So I had this historian hat on and this researcher hat on that was really wanting to find, the substance of what had happened and to have a really good understanding that was grounded in, good research and primary sources as well as secondary sources that I'd found in the archives. That's one hat. But the other hat, of course, was this abandoned daughter and a child who was still longing for this father figure and somebody who was, going to be a hero and come back and rescue Mum and I on this white charger and, change our lives, and we were going to be this happy family, together. And of course, when I met him, none of those things, I realised that none of those things were ever going to be possible. So I had these 2 reactions, both in the apartment when I was researching and when I found, all of the letters and documents and so on and reading through those, and then also in the camps as well, and thinking about, here I am discovering an individual story, but it applies to millions, of course.
Yes. That kind of leads me into my next 2 questions, actually. because I was wondering that, I mean, this book to me is as much a history as a biography and a memoir. I mean, it's all three. You know, you've kind of straddled three genres there. And you've already talked about the idea, did you write as a historian or as a daughter? But I'm wondering, was that tricky to negotiate? Was the daughter writing sometimes or the historian writing sometimes? Did you find it tricky to know what hat to put on?
I did, and in the writing process, you know, for those of you that are writers who are watching or listening to this, you know, you'll understand how important point of view is, and whose point of view are you writing from, and consistency of voice. And so I was really lucky that I've had lots of fabulous friends and fellow writers and other writing teachers who've, you know, been able to give me feedback and I guess look for that consistency of voice. And I think it was one of the things that I really struggled with, and trying to find that where's the balance between, you know, the personal aspects that go into a story like this and the history and that more objective view. And sometimes it was easy to be objective, and other times I just, you know, fell in a puddle of tears somewhere and wasn't able to cope at all. So there were, you know, but both sides, yeah.
It is. It's a key question, I think, and I think that I remember reading an article about it just a couple of weeks ago, and it was saying, you know, that a person was having great difficulty writing a story like yours, but they realised that they were writing it as the daughter and the sister, rather than as the writer. So I think in the end it has to be the writing self that's writing it, rather than the daughter or mother or sister or, you know, lover or whomever, because I think we're going to lose our voice when we do that. So I think it's really interesting then, and you maintain that, like that writing self, I think, can become the historian and can write about, you know, the father and about yourself with that same kind of consistency. I also wanted to ask though, and these are more kind of, we've been talking more content earlier, but I wanted to talk more about the writing process. And I thought this structure of this story was very much like a detective story, in that you, it's shaped around your search. Is that how you saw it from the beginning? Did you know it was going to be a detective story?
Well, when I first started, of course, I had no idea about all of the things that were going to unfold. I hadn't even really thought about going to Poland. So, you know, had I not gone to Poland, it would have been a very different story, and a much shorter one as well, I must say. But as I arrived in Poland, I decided that I would make sure that I kept a journal every day and to write every day, so that I would then have a record of it, because I know what happens, you know, life goes by pretty quickly, and sometimes you look back and you think, oh, what did happen? And then what was the sequence, and so on. So keeping that journal every day was a really important part of it. And I think actually working with I don't speak any Polish. So, you know, going to a country where I didn't speak the language, I didn't know anybody, I had a couple of barriers to overcome to try to, you know, start to gather information. And I worked with an interpreter, a young student, Chris, and he his English was fabulous, and he was still at university. But he and I really became, you know, detectives together. And I think it might have been him who first said to me, it's like being being a detective and finding all of these clues. And we would go to various, you know, official offices and try to get information. And he was always amazed at how quickly things happen. He said, this never happens in Poland. You know, these things usually you fill out a form and you come back a week later and on and on. But I arrived in Lublin in the east of Poland, where my father had lived. I arrived on the Thursday, and by the Tuesday, I'd actually was handed a certificate of inheritance for this apartment where my father had gone back to live with his first wife and his other daughter. She'd died 2 years previously, but the apartment had actually been locked up. But I was given this certificate of inheritance and the keys that I just read about on that Tuesday, just you know, a short while later.
Wow!
And so that was the start of it. And when I actually arrived at the apartment, you know, I think it's very funny now looking back on it. So I opened the door and I left the front door open to let some light in because there wasn't any electricity. And I think I sort of turned left down the hallway and went down to the kitchen, and all of a sudden I hear this shouting, and there's this woman shouting, and she comes in and she's shaking her fist at me, and I have no idea what she's saying, except that she was saying, "Polizei, polizei," and I'm thinking, well, that's the police. Why is she want to ring the police? So, but anyway, we sort of called Chris immediately and said, "Can you come? I need some help." And so, yes, I need saving. So he came and helped, and
yes.
But the neighbours, you know, they were amazed to think that, you know, this woman from Australia had turned up. They'd never heard of me. They didn't know anything about my mother. And suddenly I'd sort of inherited this apartment, and there were lots of stories about, you know, hidden gold and stolen money. And so we really did feel like detectives following all of these clues. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it's wonderful. I think and that's a good place to sort of segue into you reading a little bit about arriving at the apartment. That was around page 117, I think. If you could read us a little bit from there, would be good.
Sure. So, keys, locks and ghosts. Apartment 21, 14 Lipova Street, Lublin, Poland. Today was the day I would open the door to a world that hadn't existed for me until 3 months ago. I had no idea what to expect. I felt the 2 sets of keys cold in my hand, 6 keys on each stainless steel ring. These were the keys I had collected from the caretaker's office after handing over my inheritance certificate. I sat in the taxi on the way back to Lipova Street, trying to imagine my father, my half-sister, and her mother holding these keys in the palms of their hands, between their thumbs and forefingers, inserting them into locks, opening doors. They had used these same keys day after day, locking, unlocking, opening and closing parts of their lives, as my father had closed the door on his life in Australia and reopened his Polish life. What they revealed and what they hid was closely controlled. In the resistance, in Auschwitz, in Mauthausen, in England and in Australia, keys, locks, secrets, lies and silences had been the strategies for survival, and I assume some form of sanity.
Okay, wonderful stuff. It really kind of brings you into like the physical reality, but also the metaphorical reality there. And you discovered so many things in there. It was kind of a treasure trove of you know, letters and cards and clues about your father, and it looked like it must have been overwhelming. How did you know what path to follow amongst all of that?
It was overwhelming because here was this, it was a tiny, you know, it's 3 rooms, and how all of those adults lived in it is beyond me. And it was full of, as you say, letters and documents and so on. It was like my father had collected all of these documents, and they were just sitting there waiting for me to put them together and sort of complete the story in some way, was how I felt, you know, looking back on it. But there was a massive amount of information there, as well as belongings. Every time I opened a door, you know, everything would just tumble out. It was like, you know, everything had been jammed in, and they had saved everything. You know, there were pieces of foil, there were pieces of string, there were buttons, there were, you know, all these containers full of everything that they had kept. I don't think they'd thrown anything out for, you know, for decades. And part of that, of course, was what one man told me about, who knew my father, said that, you know, what was left over from the concentration camp was, you know, he would keep bread, and he would, you know, until it was mouldy, till it was stale, but he would never throw anything out. And so they had kept all of this, you know, for many, many years. And by the time I'd got there, it was just overflowing, every cupboard, every drawer. And so it did take a lot of going through. But, you know, my wonderful interpreter, Chris, came to the rescue again. He actually said to me, you know, we were going through these letters, because my father had actually written letters not only from immediately after the war in 1946, which meant that he knew that his first wife, Helena, was alive when he married my mother, But for the 20 years that he was in Australia, he had written letters to them. He had sent them tea and coffee. He had sent them money, medicine, knitting wool for Yanina, my half sister. So all of these were, you know, were kept carefully in that apartment. So Chris and I, you know, he'd go to university, and then at the end of university, he'd come and to the apartment, and we'd be sitting there, and I'd have this pile of documents, you know, for us to go through, and things that I thought were important. And you know, one day he opened one, and he said, washing machine instructions. Okay, don't need that one. And and then there were really important ones that, you know, we would find, and bits of letters and so on. So it was partly needing a translator to tell me what was important and what wasn't. But then the time that it actually took to read through letters that were handwritten by Helena, there were a couple that we found that were obviously drafts of letters that she'd written to my father. And so Chris said, you know, well, you know, this is going to take a long time. I said, I think we're going to both be dead by the time we get to the end of this. So, you know, and so we took this triage approach to it. You know, it was like arriving at an accident scene. Who could be saved quickly? You know, we'd hang on to that. Who needed to go to hospital? We'd save that for later. Who was dead? You know, we didn't need the washing machine instructions. So that was sort of that was the metaphor that we used. That sort of helped us.
I like it. Look, I want, we've already been talking for 40 minutes, so I want people to start thinking about the questions that they'd like to ask, and you can put those in chat, and Emma will read them out for Betty if you want to type in any questions in chat. But I had another question that I wanted to ask as well. So while people are thinking and writing, I'd like to ask you this question. Has writing this memoir, has it changed your sense of identity? For example, do you identify more now perhaps with your Polish heritage?
I think it's changed my identity in that I feel much more comfortable with who I am, understanding where I came from. And I think I said earlier, having done all of this, I found what shaped my father and caused him to make his decisions, and that then shaped my mother, and it also shaped me. So I think having that understanding has just given me a peace of mind and equanimity that I didn't have before. I don't feel particularly Polish, although when my daughter Georgie and I were in Poland and walking down the street, she said to me, Mum, look at all these people. They look just like us, you know, same square face. And she has the same square face as my father. And so I think that there are, you know, some parts of that I have obviously inherited. And I think I've also, I think I've also inherited my father's resilience and some of those positive characteristics, his perseverance, his determination. You know, when I think of what he actually went through when he was in Australia to try to get some compensation, some recognition for what he had suffered, and he did get compensation from the German government in the end before he returned to Poland, which is what he was waiting for. So I think I've inherited some of those characteristics. I'm not sure that I actually feel Polish though.
Yes, I think that's interesting. It's that kind of connection to history that you're talking about as well, that we're made of not just our biological history, but you know the cultural history and the psychological and social that have formed you, and you feel much more connected to that now because you know what that absent father was formed by.
I do. That's quite right. Yeah.
Betty, if I could just make a remark, because there were, as you were speaking, there were parts of the story that resonated with me and what I've seen my own father go through with the kind of crossing of Russian and Hungarian lines. So it's kind of question around heritage. And I wanted to ask you, you know, sifting all through that information, compared to if someone were to move countries and, I mean, change families today, I think the documentation would look very different. So was there something, I mean, I remember when I was young going through boxes and I found an old passport that was my grandmother's passport, and it was like a piece of cardboard with the Nazi eagle stamped on it. And it was amazing to me that you could have paper passports. So I wanted to ask if you had any kind of particularly sentimental pieces of paper or objects that you perhaps brought home or fascinated you?
I think one of the early pieces of paper that I came across in the apartment was my father's birth certificate. And birth certificates in those days were very different from what they are now. And this birth certificate was actually handwritten, but it talks about these two men walking across, you know, the forest to come to Nabroz. So my father was born in Tukzapi, which is just outside Lublin. And it talks about these men coming to the church, which was, you know, obviously the nearest church. And it tells you how old they were, and it tells you, you know, what actually happened. And at the bottom of it, you know, my grandfather, so my father's father, had carried this, you know, son of his to the church to have him register his birth registered. And at the bottom of it, it actually said that the clerk had signed the this birth certificate because neither the father or the person who was the witness to it could write.
Wow.
And I was just amazed by this because, you know, in other documents that I had, it said that my grandfather was a banker. But he was a man who, you know, couldn't write. So there was another mystery, you know, to solve in that. But just the way, but more about the way that that document was written. It was written as a story. And it told you a bit about, you know, those men and who they were, and a little bit about, you know, my father's mother, not very much about the woman, mostly about the men. But I just found that a really interesting document to read. And
fantastic.
So I had it translated from the records when I was in Australia before I went to Poland. But when I actually found the actual document itself, from 1909, I just, you know, it's somewhere now preserved in, you know, in a piece of plastic that so it won't get destroyed because it's a bit sort of ragged around the edges and stuck together with tape and so on. But to actually find that was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and the sort of splitting of families, it happened within my own history, and you just, I mean, I never had any reason to believe that I did not have full blood relatives. And the emphasis on bloodlines in Eastern Europe is really interesting as well. But then how the war kind of split them and divided them was really tragic. I'll field you a question from Tilly. Betsy, can you give us a little bit more insight into your childhood? So potentially between the times when your father was present in your life.
So is that a question about more about my childhood?
Yeah, about from your perspective.
Yeah. So I think I said earlier that, you know, being fostered out wasn't easy, and I was also abused in that time. So by two men in those families, in two of those families, and they're painful memories. And one of the things I think, you know, Patti was asking about the writing process, and, you know, to have to revisit that and to write about that was probably the most difficult chapter that I wrote in many ways. And it's one that I came back to later because I thought it was really important to be able to capture and to describe to others what the impact of war is and how it affects, not, as I said before, not just the people who go to war, but there are consequences that happen as a result of men and women not being able to form, you know, solid relationships or be good parents or look after their children in ways because they haven't been looked after and because they're damaged in many ways. So I think that childhood, those years before I went to boarding school, they were very difficult to write about. But I hope that I've done it well enough to be able to capture what some of that experience was like without dwelling on it too much. And Patti, you asked the question earlier about, you know, me not writing about my childhood so much, but writing about my father. And the focus of this story, I was really clear from the beginning, it was about my father. It wasn't really about me. Yes, it was about the impact on me because I wanted to, that's a theme that runs through the book, the impact of war. And how ludicrous it is that we send people to war and that we have these, you know, if you said to a primary school child, if you can't settle your differences, then you can just shoot the person. You know, if we said that, you know, you just kill people if you can't, you know, sort things out. Now, that might be a simplistic way to look at it, but it just seems to me, I don't know how we justify still sending people to war.
Yes.
So that childhood was difficult as a result of that, I think.
I was wondering too whether you were, like when you started out, were you hoping for a restored father, a father maybe better than the one that you found? Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think everybody who goes looking for family history goes looking for the heroes. I'm sure, you know, this is Family History Month, so anybody who's keen to look for their family histories, I'd really encourage you to do so. And, you know, sometimes it might be disturbing what you find, but in the end, I think that it really is worth it. And yes, I was hoping for this hero, and it wasn't quite what I found. But
yes, you found a very damaged man.
We have another question in the chat. Did writing the book allow you to forgive? Did it allow you to reach a place of forgiveness with your father?
I'm not sure about forgiveness. I think what it allowed me to do was to reach a place of understanding, and from understanding can come compassion, I think. But there is a little twist that you'll have to read the book to find out towards the end that really did temper my my feelings about my father. And I think once you read that, you'll realise that I don't think it was about forgiveness so much. It was really more about understanding.
Yes. I just wanted to ask, sorry, just another one from me. As a bookseller here, we've seen an incredible surge of historical memoirs that kind of weave the personal, the factual, like East West Street, Philip Sands, another really great example. And the idea of, you know, as oneself as an adult to go back and look at that with hindsight and to apply, you know, words like intergenerational trauma to it and this sort of newfound lingo that you have. But there's always a beauty to those memoirs, because when they get to that place, it's the childlike emotions that come to the fore, with the longing and the despair and those kind of quite, sort of primal emotions. So I was wondering, you know, just do you enjoy reading? Do you have like a newfound appetite for historical memoirs like yours? Do you like to read and see how other people approach their histories?
I think not so much at the moment. I think I'm sort of about here with with that, but in the writing of this, so, you know, as Patti says, that workshop that we did together, that was the catalyst for this whole research and writing, was 10 years ago. And over that period of time, I have read a lot of memoir, and I've read a lot of historical memoir, and I've read a lot of writing about this period of time that's both memoir and history and biography. And during that time, I think what I learnt was about some of the ways that appeal to me as writing and reading history, and ways of reading history. And for me, it was always about the personal. You know, the personal stories are the ones that resonate. And even though it might be one person's story, you know that there are hundreds of thousands of other people who've probably experienced a similar thing. So they're not top of my list at the moment for books that I go looking to read, but I have read a lot, you know, in the writing of this book, and to look at how people write about these.
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic. So, yeah, we have some lovely messages going into the chat there to congratulate you. And, yeah, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Anne's question's interesting and goes back to your sort of musings on war and what's it good for. I might rephrase the question slightly. So, although the war in long leave of absence is against totalitarian fascism in Europe, do you believe that war is necessary for freedom? Or particularly in the case of Eastern Europe, it seems to be on a historical trajectory of kind of conflict and peace. So perhaps maybe a spin on that question is, do you believe that, you know, are we locked in a sort of cycle, so to speak? Can we break out of it?
I do hope that we can, and I think otherwise, you know, history's rather impotent, isn't it, if we don't actually learn from it, and if we don't take the opportunity to read these stories and understand these stories and understand how devastating it is for families, how families become fractured and so many things are destroyed in the process. So I hope that we will find another way to be able to resolve the differences and issues that we have. But I think also by reading these stories, I certainly came to realise how much of a sacrifice people made. And I've never been in the situation where I've had to risk my life, my family's life, for the sake of freedom, for a country, for my family, for my community. I've never, been under that threat. And I hope that it never happens. And I hope that, we do find ways to live peaceful lives and to live together, understanding those differences and so on.
Can I just, before we finish, can I bring it back to your writing rather than the issues? Because I'd like to know, since you've written this memoir, which is an extraordinary one, I was wondering if you intended to write another memoir.
Well, Patti, I am.
I knew you were.
So I went to Paris, having already finished the first draft of another memoir, but it's been sitting in the bottom drawer ever since. So it is one of those that once the excitement of this has passed, I certainly want to revisit that and have a look at it. And I can't wait to actually have a look at it. I haven't touched it for probably those 10 years, really. So I can't wait to have a look at it. And I'm sure I'm going to read it and say, oh, my writing's improved so much. Look at that. Wasn't it terrible? So yeah. I'm hoping that I notice an improvement in my writing. But I also, it is an important story as well. So I know that it is something that I'm really keen to go back to and to revisit and see what it needs. And yes, and it will be the next one.
And I think with that, we can wrap it up. We're almost at 7:30, if that's okay. We've just got some late questions coming in, but we can, you can always direct them to Betty. Maybe Betty, if you had an email address or you had a social media channel. I just want to let everyone know that we have copies here at the store that you can buy. You can send us an email. We can post it out to you. We'll also have a recording of the event. So if you know someone that couldn't make it tonight, we can send them a link and they can watch it from the comfort of their own home. Will you please join me in thanking Patti and Betty for such a fantastic conversation, so meaningful. Thank you both. Digital silent claps.
Okay.
All right, lovely. Have a great night, everybody. See you soon. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Patti.
Bye.
Thank you, Betty.
And Jen and Tilly and Barbara and Gail. How lovely to see you.